All right, welcome to JourneyBox 2000, the election of the year 2000, the year that every vote actually mattered. This, of course, was the road to 270 of George W. Bush versus Al Gore, with the essential question, was it legal for the U.S. Supreme Court to decide the 2000 election? Basic introduction. It was one of the most controversial elections in U.S. history and remains so to this day. Raises questions about fairness, power, and democracy, what those things mean, and if they are being enforced. And it teaches elections, voting rights, and civic responsibility. It also tells us that elections are not just about the candidates, it's about a system that fails voters and continues in certain ways to do so to this day. Let's meet our candidates. We have got George W. Bush as the Republican, he is on the left, and Al Gore, the former vice president to Bill Clinton, on the right. So here's the problem that we had. We need 270 to win. As we exited election night, this is kind of what the electoral map looked like. As you can see, most of the votes have been counted. Most of the states have been called by the Associated Press. However, three states had not been called yet. Those were Florida, New Mexico, and Oregon. At this point, even if either candidate were to win Oregon and New Mexico, both of those states, that still would not push either candidate over 270 and would not make them qualify for the presidency. So even if either side were to win those two states of New Mexico and Oregon, it would not have mattered. So that means our problem is Florida. There it is. That's a scary thing to think about, knowing what we know about Florida. So here's kind of how it unfolded on election night. The networks were calling Florida for Al Gore at the beginning, basing the projections on early voting. At 10 o'clock, Florida starts to shift. The results tighten dramatically, and networks withdraw the call, which is something that they never really had done before. So the networks had called Florida at 7:30, 7:50 for Gore, and then they decided, you know what, we made a mistake, and they retracted the call. Around 3 a.m., the margins shrink to just a few hundred votes, which means only a couple hundred votes in the state of Florida were separating Bush and Gore. And it really was down to the wire here. At some point in the night, Gore had actually called Bush to concede, and Gore, the story goes that Gore was in the car on the way to give his concession speech to his supporters when he made the decision to call Bush and retract his concession, which, as far as we know, is the first time that a concession had been retracted in the presidential election cycle. Early morning after 3 a.m., Florida's officially declared too close to call and basically saying, we're not going to know tonight or today who the winner is. It's too close to call. We don't know. We need to do some other things. So why this timeline matters. It shows how media projections influence public perception. With that early Gore call, Gore supporters got really excited. And then when they changed it to the Bush call, the Bush supporters got really excited. So it led to a lot of tension and hostility between the two supporting groups, and believing what was right and what was wrong. So one thing that's important to talk about is that this is the first time that the major news networks had these kind of electronic vote tracking boards like they have on today that we see so often on election night. These boards will let you zoom into states, and not only into states, but into counties and precincts to see what's going on in those precincts and why this was important. Because up until this point, the verbiage when a network had called the states was very specific, and that was all leading back to the Associated Press. They would say the AP has called Michigan for Gore, or has called Florida for Bush. But now they have this technology in, and they're bringing in their own experts to kind of analyze this technology. And it's the first time that anybody's ever done it. So they're getting all this data in real time that used to be up to the AP to decide, because all of the precincts would report directly to the AP, and they still did, and they still do. But with these boards, they kind of got a little cocky and said, we know what we're doing. We have our own experts. We have the same data that the AP has. We're going to make these calls when we want to. And that's kind of one of the things that led to confusion. So I think it's important to talk about that. Of course, the ballots were a big part of this, and these were in certain counties in Florida that the ballots were creating the issue. The butterfly ballot is that top ballot up there where you can see kind of, you had to put your little push pin in the different options, and apparently they didn't line up correctly. Also, there was a thing called hanging chads, which means that the punch didn't go all the way through, and that there was kind of an outline of a punch, but not enough for the machine to read the ballot. Another thing that was interesting, and I couldn't find the newspaper clip, but I've seen it before. I couldn't find it again. There was 2 precincts around West Palm that were telling people that they needed to completely fill out every page of the ballot. And so we have these things called overvoting and undervoting. So when you overvote, you are voting for more than one candidate, and that kind of cancels out your vote, right? When you're undervoting, you're not voting for anybody. And so that's kind of easy. Both those ballots get thrown to the side. But what's interesting with the overvote was there was instructions on the ballot to completely fill out the sections. And on the back is where the write-in sections were. So people were confused. They were selecting their choice of Bush or Gore on the front, and they were flipping it over and seeing the write-in and also writing that same candidate's name on the back, thinking that they needed to fill out the ballot completely, when that wasn't the case. That was only if you were writing in a candidate. It wasn't to reinforce the candidate that you had chosen in the other section. So those were getting counted as overvotes because it was people, the system took it to mean that somebody was trying to vote twice, or select 2 candidates, which wasn't allowed, which invalidated the ballot. And those were thrown to the side when really they were just writing the name of the person that they had already selected on the front to make sure that their vote count. And in doing that extra due diligence to make their vote count, they invalidated their vote. So now the big thing, the conflicts of interest. Jeb Bush was the governor of Florida at the time. He oversaw, kind of the legal precedents in Florida. The only problem with that was he was the brother of George W. Bush. Katherine Harris was the Florida Secretary of State. She oversaw Florida elections and was very instrumental in kind of the rules of the election, and in the weeks that followed the election, the recount rules and what was legal, what wasn't legal, and what they were going to recount and what they weren't going to recount. The only problem with that was she was also the co-chair of the Bush campaign. So you have the sole person in charge of overseeing these elections working for one of the campaigns that was in that election. And I just thought that was mind-blowing that was ever allowed to happen. And guess what? Of course, it's still allowed to happen. And then John Ellis, this was a Fox News election analyst. He was one of the people on Fox News who ended up making that fake call for Bush, that second call, that incorrect call for Bush, later on in election night after Florida had gone to Gore and then been recalled, and then gone to Bush and then been recalled. That Bush call, he was very instrumental in calling the Fox News map of Florida for Bush. The only problem with that, of course, was he was George W. Bush's cousin. So you have this person who really has the perception of the public at his whim with a network like Fox News, has a big influence on the perception of people, and he's the cousin of one of the candidates. So of course, there's a bias there. Lots of lawsuits, obviously. The disagreement was mainly over counting methods, what ballots should count and what ballots shouldn't count. We talked about the write-in confusion of having to vote for somebody and then turn it around and write them in. People were saying those should be counted, those shouldn't be counted. And then there's also a Florida law that talks about if you can reasonably determine the intent of the voter, that vote should be counted. But that's also very loose language, and so interpretations of that were up for debate, and we really didn't have the time to debate that because, we need a president by January, so we don't have time to spend years and years in court, arguing over phrasing of laws. The other thing was deadlines. The deadlines were very inconvenient, especially towards the Gore side of things, trying to get things recounted, and the deadlines they were setting to get those things recounted. And this escalates to the Supreme Court, of course. So when it comes to the Supreme Court, the case is Bush versus Gore. The Supreme Court of the United States stops the recount in Florida and says they're going to handle it themselves. The decision was 5-4. The recount violated the Equal Protection Clause of the United States election code, and the Supreme Court basically just decided Bush wins the presidency. So when teaching this in elementary school, we can do things like use simplified ballots for simulations. We can have our own little class elections, little scenarios, talking about all that. We can discuss fairness in the rules. I did this with one of my lessons that Professor Cunningham got to see, where we talked about voting rights and representation and all that kind of thing. Another major thing we need to talk about, of course, is that elections have consequences. We were coming off of especially in this case, we were coming off of the 90s. It was a rather peaceful time. We had some economic troubles with NAFTA, but the biggest thing that was going on was a moral scandal with the Lewinsky scandal. As far as international policy, as far as economic policy, things were pretty calm. Of course, that all changed on 9/11. And so we have these two people, Gore and Bush, and we could sit here all day and think about, talk about and discuss and debate how things would have been different under Gore. But the truth is, neither of these men, in my opinion, were fit to be wartime presidents. And that's what happened after 9/11. A very peaceful America turned into a wartime atmosphere. And so that was something to really think about. And in my honest opinion, I think neither one of them should have been in charge during this kind of thing. I really think somebody stronger should have been there, because they were both rather weak candidates and weak politicians and weak leaders. So was it the right choice for the Supreme Court to step in and decide this election? The answer that I found is yes, and let me tell you why. The Constitution, the constitutional foundation for the Supreme Court, the court's powers comes from Article 3 of the United States Constitution. It gives the Supreme Court authority over cases involving federal law, disputes between states, and constitutional questions. So basically it says that if there is a federal issue, if there is a state issue that is affecting continuity of government, or that is affecting the operation of the federal government, the Supreme Court has the authority to step in and take charge of that and make decisions based on as close as what they can to the law. So in this situation, we're missing a president. You can't get more federal than that, right? January 20th is coming. We have to have a new president. We have to have continuity of government. We have to have somebody in charge in that office. And so in this case, given the bare bones wording and very vague language of the Constitution, yes, the Supreme Court made the right choice to support that continuity of government. So these are 4 of my sources. I also had a 5th source, but these are the sources. And then the epilogue. This is my 5th source. So shortly after the 2000 election, a couple years later, the National Opinion Research Center at the University of Chicago went through all 175,000 disputed ballots in Florida. Now, mind you, it was only a couple hundred that were causing the riff and causing the margin to be as slim as it was. The margin was very slim. It was only a couple hundred votes that was hanging the election. So they reviewed 175,000 disputed ballots in Florida. They looked at the ballot machines that had rejected or the ballots that the machines had rejected or flagged, and they examined the different possible counting standards. And when they summed everything up, they looked at every ballot. They followed the Florida statute. They followed the federal statutes to count the votes, throw out the ones that needed to be thrown out, and count the ones that need to be counted. And then at the end of the day, Bush would have still won, was their finding. So regardless of which way you slice it, an independent research came in and was able to say that when all was said and done, even if everything had been recounted, Bush still would have won the presidency. So yeah, that's the 2000 election.